Welcome to our session on merging Indigenous with non-Indigenous values for student success. We are situated in Ontario, Canada. We would like to acknowledge the Algonquin Nation, whose traditional and unceded territory we live in. This is Linda Manning coming to you from Ottawa, Ontario. I will introduce myself first and Dwight will follow. I am keen to follow the well-being of immigrants and to recognize the value that they bring to economies all over the world. I was born a migrant and have always seen myself that way. Born to a military family in the US, I started my first years in Libya and in the UK. I returned to the US at the age of 10. So after all the adapting I did to fit into the British school system, I learned to adapt to, for me, a brand new US culture. And I can tell you that there are a lot of different cultures even in the US. I did high school in New Hampshire, university and grad school in Chicago. I earned tenure and promotion in Missouri. And then I immigrated to Canada where I am now. It's interesting to me how people adapt and how host communities adapt to facilitate migration. It should be a win-win for everybody. After many years as an economics professor in the US and migrating to Canada, my research focus and passion turned to the integration of skilled immigrants into the workplace to maximize the professional capacity of newcomers and at the same time the growth of Canadian business. For similar, I feel a keen connection to the rights and responsibilities of Indigenous people. It intersects well with my belief system. I work closely with my colleague Dwight Powless, who has helped me to see both the unique characteristics of bias and challenges faced by Indigenous peoples, and also those that are strikingly similar to immigrants. I first encountered continuous improvement when I was teaching at the University of Missouri. It's the Rolla campus. Now they call it the Missouri University of Science and Technology. It was back in the 90s, and the chancellor had led a strategic plan for continuous improvement. It was pretty successful because the university was university winner of the Baldrige National Quality Award. So that's where I learned how something like continuous improvement can relate to the learning environment and to student success. One thing that I noticed right away is that the process almost forced people to talk about values. It just would not have been successful without an open agreement and acknowledgement of what our values were as an organization. I remember one of the most difficult discussions was around this perceived conflict between serving our students and ensuring the sustainability of the institution. Turns out this is a fool's choice. It turns out that long before Deming and Duran, who were fathers of continuous improvement, Indigenous communities were practicing a well-developed continuous improvement approach, and that's what we'd like to share with you today. I'd like to note that the model we will talk about is very closely aligned with Deming's original approach.
My name is Dwight Powless. I'm a Mohawk born in the Six Nations Reserve in Ontario. I attended the Mohawk Institute Residential School when I was in my youth. I've also been a nomad most of my life. After high school, I joined the Royal Canadian Air Force. After the Air Force, I attended Fanshawe Community College, where I earned a post-secondary diploma. In 1975, I began my work with Canada Post and Technical Services. In the early 1980s, I was lucky enough to meet an old Anishinaabe man who was one of the few people that I ever met in my life that knew a lot about Anishinaabe culture. He had been born in southern Alberta and in a teepee and grew up living his own Anishinaabe traditional life. For me, he was a real exception because I never did meet anyone like him before in my life or since. It was very difficult then and now to try to find and understand Anishinaabe culture, especially from someone who had that amount of knowledge and experience. To learn that Anishinaabe culture, it took a lot of effort and a lot of commitment. In order to continue learning from him, because I met him in Ontario, I moved west, was able to reconnect, and started to learn more on a person-to-person basis. When I moved to Winnipeg, I became the manager of tech services for Canada Post. At Canada Post, I was in charge of looking after mail sorting equipment, trying to keep the equipment running without too much downtime so that we'd still be able to process mail on time. But during that period of time, I became acquainted with the quality manager there. From him, I learned that we could improve our downtime and he became my mentor and still is. He offered me information about Duran and continuous improvement. And then I read Deming, and I took a university course on quality. During this period, I was also learning about my own culture, and I began to see the relationship, and I was able to apply quality improvement and the basis of Anishinaabe culture as part of my job. I could see the real connection. I retired in 2009 from Canada Post after 34 years, where I had finally worked my way into human resources or human relations and legislative programs. I finished my career at Canada Post as the first Aboriginal Relations Manager. In the role, I was instrumental to have Canada Post achieve, and being the only federal crown corporation to achieve, a gold hallmark for progressive Aboriginal relations from the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business. Upon my retirement, I was recruited by Algonquin College to enhance and increase the Indigenous platform within the college. I had the opportunity to influence not only the development of students, but also to increase the different programs offered by the college. One of those programs was an employment program based on personal development and accountability, which we call the Developmentor Program. This program was developed in partnership with Tim Hortons that would hire and employ Aboriginal students who needed work in order to be more successful in their studies. This program received the Chairman's Award from the International Partnership Network. In order to receive the network or to receive the award, I made a trip to Belgium, Brussels, Belgium, and was not only able to talk about the program, but was also glad for receiving the award in recognition of.
Both of us have experience with continuous improvement methodologies applied to improving the experience and performance of students in post-secondary institutions. Over the years, as Dwight and I discussed our shared experiences, we discovered that it's values that drive continuous improvement. In business, the focus tends to be on reducing waste, lowering costs, and improving customer service, things like that. In other words, the goal is higher profits. The value is higher profits. There's a strong profit motive that drives planning and implementation of continuous improvement in academia too, but there's also the element of individual and organizational development. This is closer to the way Deming saw it. He believed that individual development is essential and that the culture of improvement should be woven into the organization's culture. When this is overlooked, it's one of the reasons that continuous improvement initiatives so often fail. Research reveals common reasons for continuous improvement to fail. There may be a failure to understand and agree on what's needed. What do we need to improve and why? There can be a top-down approach that dictates the change without full engagement of stakeholders. Each stakeholder has a role to play and is impacted in some way. It's important to understand those roles and the impacts they have. Improvements are sometimes not aligned with organizational values. You just need to name the organizational values that you are working with and intentionally align with them. Another issue is that improvements are not expressed as measured. When it's measured, it gives you the information that you need and can interpret effectively. So many times the reporting structure for a project includes important aspects like lessons learned, and then the report is placed very neatly on a shelf somewhere or posted on a web page, often never to be seen again. Sometimes the changes that work may never get incorporated into the culture of the organization. If they are, stakeholders end up with a much better understanding of organizational values and the expectations going forward, and that helps define how they will operate in the future. If not, then there's a vague sense of having done something, but not really understanding how it affects you or others. Since this is supposed to be a continuous improvement cycle, an outcome like this flattens enthusiasm and commitment to future improvement. And finally, somebody moves the cheese. The original goals get lost, and the tendency is to try to frame the situation as a success without assessing actual outcomes to the initial desired outcome.
So in 2015, we did a study of Indigenous students' performance at Algonquin College. Up to that point, we were doing numerous projects and programs to support the Indigenous population, but we didn't know whether they were really impacting performance. The first thing we had to identify was there an impact on that performance? We had some stories and testimonials, but we still didn't know whether that impacted the student population overall. we had to take a look at the student database. The student database contained information in the format that we had to change slightly in order to get the information we were looking for, to identify if Indigenous students were progressing, what their persistence levels were, how were they performing, and what were their completion rates. Past published research shows that those were indicators of student success. Linda has the expertise to analyze the data. I have the expertise to interpret and look beyond the numbers to identify what was happening in the communities and look beyond the numbers. The results confirm the story that we needed to tell about the success of Indigenous students.
In the end, the study took us to a new level. Beyond just the percentage of graduates or dropouts, we had information on student and the organization's readiness, how effective recruitment and retention efforts were, the student college experience, and even prospects for student employment. This project changed the shape of the discussions with the college, with the Indigenous communities that the students come from, and the government who funds the programs. It was during this time that the idea of iDraft was formulating in Dwight's mind. It wasn't enough just to identify where we are and where we wanted to go. He said, unless we also understand how the changes made will affect all of the stakeholders, and only if we measure those outcomes and align them carefully with the values of Indigenous students, they will surely fail. With this information, stakeholders were able to identify a clear path forward towards student success that ensures relationship building with communities and growth in student registrations and graduations. The funders appreciated that it also made it possible to see how to make funding more efficient.
iDraft stands for setting intentions, making decisions, getting ready, which is preparing, taking action, finishing, and transitioning to the next phase. The iDraft model is built on my perception and experience of Anishinaabe culture and continuous improvement. As I said earlier, I found a natural alignment between the way we do things in culture and Deming's continuous improvement model. In Anishinaabe culture, the focus is on individual development and group culture centered around core values. Two important values are honesty and kindness. And two important outcomes are sustainability and inclusion. Only when we practice kindness and honesty, and only when the outcomes create sustainability and inclusion, are they successful. Since Algonquin College, Linda and I have worked with several colleges and universities in Canada, applying the iDraft model to serve as a guide to improving student experience, performance, and outcomes.
Setting intentions is a step that often does not get the attention it needs. To figure out where you are and where you want to go is important, and there just doesn't seem to be enough time set aside for looking at the past lessons learned, collecting data to understand the current situation, discussing with experts and other stakeholders who will be affected by the change. Only after all this is done can you set clear, agreed intentions. You have objectives, metrics, and a process for communication and engagement. Decisions can then be made by leadership with kindness and honesty. This means the group knowledge, needs, and resources take priority over individual preferences. That is, the leader's preferences sometimes, right? Leaders speak on behalf of group members, not for themselves. Readiness or preparation is the most frequently overlooked element of good continuous improvement. Taking time to prepare staff, for example, giving them the training they need, helping them to adopt new ways of doing things, and giving them space to communicate difficulties that need to be addressed. Taking action seems straightforward. A way of thinking about action that I find compelling is to do good, to do well, and do right. What this means to me is that doing good will generate profit despite the intuition that so many people have that it is a trade-off. But also, for truly effective change, it must be done right. In other words, you must consider the impact of change on individuals and groups and make sure that they align with your values. The finish is also often overlooked. Some programs just keep going without stopping to check to see if the outcomes you wanted were achieved. What are the lessons learned? How have you communicated these to your stakeholders? And there is also very little intentional transition. If you're talking about a continuous cycle, then you need to find a way to incorporate successful, measured changes into the next phase. If this doesn't happen, then you end up finding yourself with an incomplete cycle that somehow there's a need to restart. And if the previous cycle doesn't have all the elements of success, it will be more difficult to achieve the necessary engagement to do that again. So in our work with post-secondary institutions, we help with implementing the stages of the iDraft model, based on where they are and what their goals are. Every project starts with an understanding of what is. Typically, an institution focuses on gaps and what doesn't work well. As we collected data on student performance, we saw a consistent pattern. Indigenous students appear to perform less well than their non-Indigenous counterparts, but there's a significant percentage who do as well or better than the others. We wanted to know more about these students, so we turned to those graduates and invited them to participate in a study to explore their success, their resiliency, and their persistence. What makes them different? Well, we did a series of one-to-one interviews with about 15 graduates. Participants were invited by Indigenous community members who knew them personally and who deemed them to be resilient. The purpose was to reveal, from the perspective of successful students, what the source of their resiliency was and what post-secondary institutions and communities can do to nurture that resilience in others. The 15 participants comprised individuals from the ages of 20 to 35. Some were urban, some were on reserve, some were male and female, of course, some working at hourly wages, and some in management. Some were First Nations, some were Inuit and Cree, and even some Métis. Despite their differences, qualitative analysis of semi-structured interviews revealed 5 main elements that participants all had in common.
An adult role model who took an interest in them, recognizing their values and helping them to become more self-aware and world-aware were powerful influencers. The more their worldview turned outward, the more able they seemed to be able to set realistic goals and started working toward them. They expressed self-respect and respect for their heritage, which helped them to stand up to prejudice and maintain their sense of self.
Family and community are sources of both strength and obligation, and their Indigenous culture is at the center of everything. When they speak of their achievements, they speak of them in the context of their Indigenous and community values, which brings everything full circle. Their success is correlated to that reciprocity, that sense that strength comes from group, and it is the individual's obligation to be the best they can be according to core values in order to give back and strengthen the group. When these results are revealed to post-secondary institutions and community leaders, it opens a dialogue that empowers all stakeholders.
Thank you for attending this session. Please contact us if you have any questions or would like to share your own experiences.